So sources for decryption, as you mentioned, are books, the Shakespeare plays, and other written works by Sir Francis Bacon, known works of his.
Yes.
Okay. And then maps.
Maps of, in the original decryption, there's a whole key. Well, I call it a key that creates the algorithm for unlocking and rearranging all of the characters of the plaque. And so in the transposition ciphers, and one of them is key 38. And in key 38, he lists all of his masks. It was called E-Masker. And so in this decryption table, he lists several names of what many of his aliases were. And the first one I discovered was and I had no idea who this person even was when I found the name, because, as I said, transposition ciphers appear in certain shapes. And here in the letter T, I see the name Tinelli. And then around that, in the shape of a letter Y, was the name Tiberio. So I searched Tiberio Tinelli, and he was a Renaissance master artist. Okay. And so that led me to his paintings, and I was able to start seeing, pictorial ciphers and other forms of ciphers within those paintings. One in particular of a young German doctor is really fascinating. I included a decryption of that one in my next book. But so here was a name that I had never heard of before, and it leads me to, he claims this was an alias of his. And so I go, and sure enough, there's the evidence right in one of the paintings. And so he says, Tiberio Tinelli was good, but my best alias was Samuel de Champlain. Now, imagine how I felt when I was super excited when I made this discovery, but then I was immediately deflated, because I thought, who in the world is ever going to believe this nonsense? Who in their right mind, hears that and says, oh yeah, sure, that makes sense. No one's going to do that. I mean, we have, so many, think of all of the professors who make a living of just studying Samuel de Champlain as, this living, breathing man. And he was, but it was Bacon becoming this person, right? And so in my first book, I actually did a timeline, a side-by-side comparison of where the men were at any given time. And there were no conflicts. There was no reason whatsoever that Bacon could not have been here in the New World, being Champlain. He even says, I rule my nation finally. Here he was, a king without a throne, and he was, here thinking that, well, I can create one here. And who was one of the main people behind the colonization scheme? Francis Bacon. So all these pieces started to come together, and they fit. So yeah, that led me to the maps of Samuel de Champlain, full of cipher messages. In fact, the famous 1612 navigational chart. This is what led me back to research for the show The Curse of Oak Island on History Channel. That map has a course encrypted within it that leads directly to the island. Okay, so that island was very, very significant to him. Historians, read, for example, you wanted to talk about New Atlantis. One of the big mysteries of New Atlantis is, why was Francis Bacon writing about an island off the coast of Peru when he had never been sailing and he had never been there? Well, he had been there multiple times. In fact, not as Champlain, but as the first mate to Sir Francis Drake. That was one of the big messages, was that he was his navigator, his first mate. And this is corroborated by prisoners that Drake had taken, a Spanish prisoner and one Portuguese sailor. They went back and reported back to the authorities in Spain that Drake was a master artist, and that he also had other artists with him. One of them was his nephew, John Drake, and they were both extremely talented artists, and they were painting the coastlines of all of these sites in such detail that any other navigator would not be able to mistake what they were looking at. That was what they were doing. And the prisoners said that they were constantly holed up in Drake's cabin painting. And John Drake, as I calculated all of the values, it's Bacon, in the cipher systems. And so using the alias formula, it just spells out his name over and over again. So here you have this, and this was not on the circumnavigation. This was his second foray. So at that time, Bacon during the circumnavigation was actually in France. So he wouldn't have been available to do that.
Okay. And Sir Francis Drake is obviously the famous explorer, the famous sailor, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth I.
Her privateer, I
Her
guess
privateer.
Spanish,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so in your research, Francis Bacon is born in 1561.
Correct.
Okay. Well, that's commonly known. That's Orthodox history.
Yeah.
So what was he doing? So when did he make, how old was he when he made the trip with Francis Drake?
It would have been after Sir Nicholas died. So what I've been doing is I've been piecing together the timeline because he was in France, and this is where he was, becoming a master artist. This is, where he was probably honing and finishing his skills, which I'm sure he practiced throughout his entire youth with the Bacons. And so, he's documented being in France at the French court, and his uncle Henry literally gave him the red carpet treatment, as though, people always wonder, why was he welcomed, by the French court so warmly? It's because he was blood. He was a prince. He was the Dauphin of France, and they knew it. And so they were like, well, you can't have your seat. I have it, but we're going to give you a warm welcome, and you can do whatever you want while you're here.
And
So
that's Uncle Henry would be, is it King Henry the Third?
that would have been yes,
fourth?
third, because the fourth was Henry of Navarre.
Okay. And now, did Bacon come upon secret societies in France?
Oh yes. In fact, the king created, while he was there, a new society called the Order of the Holy Spirit. And so I think that was the outward outspring of an undercurrent that had to do with their royal lineage. But when it comes to say Freemasonry, one of the specific messages was that my Fama fraternity evolved into Freemasonry. So Bacon, in my mind, according to that message, was responsible for the creation of speculative Freemasonry. I think he saw operative Freemasonry as being the perfect opportunity to kind of create this new group based upon the Rosy Cross. Now, the Rosy Cross was not the big group that everyone seems to think it was. This was a creation of Francis Bacon, Sir Walter Raleigh, perhaps Ben Jonson. I think he was involved, and probably Drake. At its inception, it was just kind of a joke. It was this little secret brotherhood that they created that really, when they wrote the manifestos are deeply encoded, and they state right in them, not to read them literally, that they speak in allegories and parables and symbols. And so that's how those manifestos are supposed to be understood. Historians have made a mistake saying that, there was a guy named Christian Rosenkreuz who, back, several hundred years ago, started this group. It was a joke.
Okay. And can you explain a little bit the 2 or 3 manifestos that you're talking about?
Yeah, so the first one was the Confessio, I believe. And or no, there was the Fama Fraternitatis, then there was Confessio, and then there was the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. And that was claimed to have been written by Andreas, I think it was, Johann Andreas. I believe, however, in my book, I demonstrate how Bacon used Andreas as a mask. So that's another confusing element to all of this. We have aliases. We also have masks. These are living, breathing people that, either Johnson or Bacon or Raleigh would write something and use their name and attach it to it and put it out there. And you know, Andreas even said that the Rosy Cross was a windlass, which means a plaything of the winds. Right? It was a joke, and so what it did was it eventually, I think, in order to record Bacon's secret history into the organization of the Freemasons, that's what he did. He created the Fama Fraternitatis, the Rosy Cross, and he used the trappings and the symbols used by the Rosy Cross to create speculative Freemasonry, in my opinion.
Okay. And can you describe what speculative Freemasonry is?
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. Well, you have operative Freemasons, right? Operative Freemasons are, well, they're stonemasons. They go around, they build things. They're builders, right? They operate as masons in building. Speculative Freemasonry is different in that these are members of Freemasonry, but they're more in tune with the esoteric messages and the teachings of right living and all of the order, or basically the plays that go along with each degree. And so they use it more as a way of improving the membership, right? So that in that sense, it's speculative in that they view this idea of building in terms of the person, not a cathedral, right? So it's the idea of they take the raw material of their apprentice when they enter, and they are the rough block, and they need to chisel them to make them into the right and true ashlar, right stone. So it's the speculative Freemasonry is involved in the symbolism and the teachings of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that was a way for them to communicate with one another, and
yes.
Okay, and for future generations as they anticipated.
Absolutely, and it's encoded right in the name Freemasonry. I kind of show this in my next book. It was the eminent Bacon scholar Peter Dawkins states that the name Francis actually means free. Okay, and in fact, when you calculate the value of the word free in simple cipher, it's 33, which is the value of Bacon in simple cipher. When you do it in reverse cipher, it's 67, the value of Francis. So encoded in the word free itself is the name Francis Bacon. We take that out, we're left with the word masonry. We take out the S-O-N, we're left with Mary. Francis Bacon, son out of Mary.
Wow.
In the name, there's a message.
Yeah.
And so, again, as I continue to stack up all of this evidence, people are starting to finally take notice and recognize that I might actually be onto something here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, getting back to the idea of, say, the New Atlantis, the idea that he was first mate with Francis Drake and went around the world and was basically privateering and learning how to privateer from the master himself, the most successful privateer in English history. There's no reason why he wouldn't have been off the coast of Peru multiple times, and he would be familiar with that area and be able to describe it the way he does in the New Atlantis. So for getting back to all of the literature of Bacon, these ciphers also appear in his essays. Anyone who's interested, if you look up Francis Bacon's essays, look up specific numbers of them, and each of them are numbered. And so if you use Francis Bacon's numbers that are significant to him and his group, you can actually go through his essays and start identifying, particularly if you're fortunate enough to find a facsimile of one of the originals, the way the text was printed at that time period. There are going to be plenty of little Easter eggs in there to find.
Okay. And you can find some of his secret messaging in modern editions, but to really get the most of them, you have to go back to the 1623 folio or the original publications done in the 1600s.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a facsimile, obviously the first folio. I also have a facsimile of the 1611 King James Bible, which, most scholars acknowledge that, he had it in his possession for at least a year as he did some final edits. And I can't even begin to tell you the numbers of messages appearing in the 1611. It's mind-boggling.
Mhm.
Other people who have, kind of taken up the mantle, my challenge of saying, "Hey, please try this for yourself." Um, One of them, his name is William Russell. He lives in England, and he caught one of my podcasts, and he says, "Wow, this guy is absolutely crazy," but he he certainly seems like he believes it. And
Mhm.
at the end of the show, I said, "Listen, gang," I said, "I know this all sounds unbelievable." I said, "But if you don't believe me, try it for yourself. See what you're able to find. Start applying this, in the proper context, and you're going to be amazed." And so he did. And next thing I know, he reached out to me. He says, "I thought you were bloody crazy." He says, "But you're right." He says, "It all works."
Mm.
And so next thing he and I have become very good friends, and he's continuing this work. Another guy from Kentucky, Jason Mercer, uh, he's in it. Our friend John Edwards of Oak Island fame, he's been on the show recently in the War Room. He's been also corroborating a lot of my findings, and so the group just kind of keeps growing and growing. And that's really satisfying for me to see.
Yeah. And with the 1611, you do have a pictorial in the beginning of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament.
Hmm.
Is this where people are finding a lot of messaging in those two pictures?
Oh yeah, yeah. All of the pictures, all of the pictures in the 1611 have messages, all of them. And in particular, right now, like I said, I can't share too much of William and John's work because they're keeping it very hush hush because they want to debut it on my podcast, The Ghost of Bacon, and watch my face drop.
Mm.
They keep joking when they say, "You're not going to believe what we found." And the thing is, I will believe what they found, but I know it's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, in each of these images, if you go, and I mentioned Sir Walter Raleigh earlier, um, his History of the World in 5 parts. You go to the frontispiece of that, the symbolism there and the hidden messages in that image are just phenomenal. So it's everywhere, and like I said, I can't do it alone. And so that was the first realization, the fact that I decrypted the plaque on my own and saw the depth and breadth of what it really meant. I realized that this is way too much for me. This is
Mhm.
way too big for me. A little hobbit from the Shire, this is way too big for me. So, yeah, that's when I started the podcast. I said, listen, anybody who wants to learn how to do this, I'll make myself available. And, all my materials are on my website, theghostofbacon.com. And you just start applying it. And it's simple math.
Okay.
It's just easy to do.
Yeah. And to go back to Freemasonry, this is I guess not the only sort, but geometry. Geometry comes
Yes.
to play with deciphering the messages. So, how is geometry used to decipher messages?
Oh, such a great question. Joe, basically, there are um, in many of these images, many of these, even in the writings, um, there are, how do I say this? Suggestions for lines, right? From line of sight where your eye tracks. Now you'll notice, like you sent me a piece in the email, and it had that image at the bottom that was like a inverted triangle, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
If you measure the angles of the edges of those, the angles themselves are numbers that can be read as signatures, you know.
Mhm.
And so that's one way. Another way is through geometrical alignments. The technique that Jason Mercer uses, he uses a draftsman's technique, which is a classic techniques that Freemasons would use. Of You look at the page and you draw a line from corner to corner, and then from the other corner, you draw another line from that corner to the other corner. That identifies the center spot, right, of the page. And then you can draw lines across that center spot and then down the center spot. And with just those lines alone, geometry will start to form. But then what he does is he then starts using, if there are significant alignments on that page with letters, if the line crosses a whole series of letters, what you do is you calculate the values of each of those letters and you add them up in the different cipher systems to see what words or what values appear. And if all of a sudden it says 67, it's, oh, Francis. Oh, 33, Bacon, Francis Bacon. His signature is here. So in that way, you can use lines in geometry to identify letters that are supposed to fit together in a message.
Okay.
So that's just one. That's just one way. I'm reminded of Christopher Morford's work and Peter Amundsen's work on this plaque of Shakespeare's funerary monument. They both found. Chris Morford found what we call the Morford triangle, which is a 3-4-5 triangle, right triangle, and it connects the letters in the name Bacon, and one on the right hand side of it. Peter Amundsen, he identified the Bacon pentagram or pentacle. There's a pentagon. You can connect the letters of the name Bacon in a perfect pentagon, and then when you do them in order, it forms a pentacle. So in that way, geometry can be used. So the other way is when you look at an image, oftentimes there will be lines suggested by the angle of the text, or maybe it's a part of a drawing, or you'll have an angle of a line, and if you extend that angle of that line down through, it will cross over letters and in the text, and then you calculate those values. Just one more way that looking at geometrical alignments will produce messages.
And like
and
you,
again, just go ahead.
well, and the degree of an angle, right? So if two lines meet and it's a 33-degree angle, then that's a Francis Bacon signature.
Yeah, it's purposeful, and again, it has to be within the context of something that is associated with this group, right? We're not just looking around and seeing the word or the number 111, which is the case cipher value of the name Bacon. Say, oh, there's Bacon. No, there has to be a context as well. Otherwise, it turns into a game of confirmation bias, where you start to see what you want to see. And so, again, if you have a whole series of these geometrical alignments, for example, and they all produce these known values, there you go.
Repeatability.
Repeatability.